Hey, this is Joshua, your cultural Catholic, coming back with a second episode on my mini series on the history of British India. And when we last left off, we were talking about how India became to being a British colony. With a little recap, it started in the 15th century with the colonization attempts by the Portuguese, and as time progressed, more nations started to get in on the action in India, culminating in the Seven Years' War, or as it's known in America, the French and Indian War, ending French rule in India and consolidating most of India under a good portion of India under British East India Company, with the final push towards full colonization in 1849 with the conquest of Punjab, which is now Pakistan, with the border of which is now in Pakistan. And yeah, and I said that I would pick up right at the Indian Rebellion of 1857. Now, the Indian Rebellion of 1857 started in May 10th of 1857 and went to the 1st of November 1858. This was a fairly long rebellion. Most of the troops rebelling were from Bengal and central India. Bengal at the time, or Bangladesh as it's known now, was part of British India, but eventually, and as we know, it eventually became its own country. And it was the first point of rule for the British through the British East India Company. And how they did it was a lot of local rulers, and that's how they conquered largely much of India. Most of the time, the local rulers were left in place, although if more pliable partners could be found, they were used to replace the current rulers at the time. And this system worked more or less from the late 18th century to the mid of the 19th century. And there were still some fairly powerful political players in India, such as the Mughal Empire and several other independent states, princely states. And when the war started out, it was largely blamed on a rumor of how the cartridges for the muskets were greased. Now, in India, there's a plethora of religions. The two largest are Hinduism and Buddhism, not Buddhism, Islam. And in both, there are certain animals where they cannot consume them. With Hindus, it is cows. Cows are considered sacred, and if beef grease is used, it would be considered sacrilege. And so that could have caused a lot of friction between Indian troops and their British officers, which is typically how it worked. And most soldiers in India were not in fact British or British East India Company, but local mercenaries raised from the high caste peasantry, typically the Brahmin and Kshatriya castes, if they were Hindu. And within the Muslim community, there were rumors that it was being greased by pig fat, and in Islam, pig is considered haram, which means forbidden or unclean. And so that caused a huge rift between the officers and and a lot of the soldiers, especially from the Bengal region, who were the first to actually openly rebel. Um, and there were several other incidences as well, but one of the bigger ones that I have heard of was actually presented in Queen Victoria's Empire, which was a documentary done by PBS and narrated by Donald Sutherland. It was a very, very good documentary. I will put a link to the IMDb in the description below, and I suggest you guys check it out. It doesn't just cover the Indian Rebellion, but the entire breadth of Queen Victoria's reign. But again, the way that they cover uh, uh, the Indian Rebellion also brings a very interesting aspect to it. So there were a lot of nationalist elements within India. Most people don't like being ruled by people who aren't them, and so one nationalist leader, he was sent to England to try to change things, kind of get a little bit more autonomy for the Indians. Of course, that didn't work, and so on the way back to India, he took a detour to the Crimea. Nowadays, we know the Crimea as a catalyst for conflict between Ukraine and Russia. But back in the late 1840s, early 1850s, it was the site of a massive war between the French and British and the Russians, with the French and British fighting the Russians on behalf of the Turks. It was a long, complicated thing that we don't need to get into. And what he saw was a lot of incompetence among the British soldiers and British leadership. So he thought, if I were to get a coalition, we could be able to beat the British, because the Russian army at the time was not very good, and so if the Russians were having a fairly good time of it holding the British back, then maybe the Indians could overthrow the British. Obviously, it took them a while because the Crimean War did not end for ended in the early 1850s, and the Indian Rebellion didn't start for another 6 years at least. Um, but the Greece controversy was just like the biggest catalyst. Um, and once it started, there was a massive amount of bloodshed. And actually, Heather Street's The Martial Races actually brings a lot of insight into how a lot of the actions in the war were portrayed. So, basic overview: the rebels did a lot of atrocities against British women and children and civilians. The British and their Sepoy allies, who were typically from the Punjab, which was recently conquered, and filled with a lot of ex soldiers who needed a job, uh, committed a lot of atrocities against rebel Sepoys and their ethnic or tribal groups. But within the British papers, which was a very complicated structure, which Heather Streets really gets into in her book, um, really portrayed the British and their allies' actions as justified based on how the atrocities occurred among the rebel sepoys. And really, sometimes it doesn't make sense because rebel atrocities would happen after the British atrocities, so it may seem like a tit for tat, but it largely used the masculine language of the time. So the sepoys that were rebelling were feminine and were weaker and were not manly like the British or their Punjab allies or many of the other allies that stayed with the British, because there were a lot of Indian princely states that stayed on the British side. And as the war raged, it was fairly disjointed. There was an overall idea to break British rule, but the means to do that were fairly localized among the various rebel forces, and there wasn't very much communication. Um, the British scrambled to send more troops to assist, obviously, European troops from the homeland. And by the end of the war in November of 1858, the rebellion was crushed, and India was completely transitioned. One of the major factors was the Mughal Empire. That was destroyed by the end of the rebellion and was disintegrated by the British after the war ended. The British East India Company basically fell apart after this, and all of its territories were subsumed by the British. Princely states that rebelled against the British were completely disintegrated and joined up to various princely states that stayed loyal. And the way that the British Indian Army was recruited and created was very much shaken up. And that will be the video for next week. Again, links to sources will be put in the description box below. If you want to check out the original video that started this miniseries, you can click right over here. If you would like to subscribe and help the channel grow, click here. And to help my other channels grow, you can click right on either side of the screen up here. This is Joshua Zeller, your Cultural Catholic, signing off.